Hello, my name is David Romanelli, and I am the director of the Loyola University Chicago Debating Society. And it's my pleasure to welcome the 2018 British national team to debate the Loyola University Debating Society on the motion, "This House believes that the American dream is dead." It's been our pleasure to work with the CIDD of the National Communication Association in sponsoring this event, and the School of Communication here at Loyola University Chicago, and the Comm Studies major. I'd like to introduce our debaters before we start the debate and just tell you a little bit about what we're trying to do here. This debate is designed to promote an understanding of how arguments work and to have a friendly exchange with students from around the world. The debate here doesn't mean these are the actual positions and the beliefs of the students here today. It's just an educational activity. So first and foremost, I'd like to introduce Mae Flanagan, who will be representing the British, along with Owen Mooney. And representing Loyola University Chicago, we have Mr. Evan Means and Matthew Yasuka. The format will be 2 7-minute speeches for each team to construct arguments, followed by a 5-minute rebuttal. During the constructive speeches, opponents from both sides may rise and ask questions of their opponents, and the idea is not to determine who is the absolute winner, but to see who does a good job of presenting arguments and making a case for their side. So without further ado, I'd like to invite Maeve to represent the government side of this proposition.
Good afternoon. The American dream is dead, and we think that it should burn in hell on our side of this debate. Look, the notion that if you work hard, you will succeed is just factually untrue in America right now. And we don't think that it's fair if the opposition get up here today and say and point to cases, exceptional cases, like people like Bill Gates or people like Obama, right? Because they need to prove that anyone in the United States of America, out of millions of people, any single one of them who worked hard can pursue happiness, can be financially secure, can have a job, which means they can pay off their debt, they can get on the property ladder. We just don't think that is true in the United States of America. And I have two major reasons in this first speech. The first is that there are structural reasons, which means that being individually working really hard, even as an individual, means that you will never overcome those structural barriers. And the second is that even the very notion of the American dream justifies and upholds a broken system, and that actually keeps people down and makes sure that they can't access the pursuit of individual happiness. So, on individual reasons, look, the American dream is this idea that no matter who you are, no matter where you come from, that if you put in the hard work that you can make it, right? And it glorifies and it fetishizes this idea of pulling yourself up by your bootstraps, and it assumes that if you work hard, you will be above the poverty line, you will be able to afford healthcare, and you won't be laid off or unemployed, right? But this is just not true, okay? Because individuals, as individuals, cannot change the economy. They can't change the fact that the global financial system crashed in 2008, and they're probably not responsible for that fact either, right? It's incredibly difficult as an individual to secure yourself from things like structural unemployment, to secure yourself from the fact that the education system in America is inadequate, right? It's impossible to secure yourself from the fact that you may face barriers on the basis of your gender, when I finish this point, or because you're a minority, or because you're a working class woman. Look, things like mass incarceration, things like mass wage stagnation, things like massive student debt, and the fact that there's no accessible healthcare in the United States of America. Just because you work hard doesn't mean that you can overcome these barriers. Yes?
Yes, you speak a lot about the problems in America, but what brings you to a multi-month tour of America itself? And of course, we welcome you, Tim.
Yeah, so we're trying to learn from you guys and the abject mistakes that you are making, and the fact that we think that your system is fundamentally broken, which is the position that we stand here. We're coming from a context of the United Kingdom where people do have access to socialised healthcare, whereas if you are sick and dying, that they will take you into the hospital and they will treat you for free because they respect your right and your human dignity and think that you deserve that as a human being. That's not something that you have in the United States, and we hope that on this tour they will convince you people that that's absolute madness, right? And that saying that individuals are responsible for all these things upholds that broken system. But look, just finishing up this first point, right? The idea that people who are one paycheck away from poverty, or the people who are on food stamps, right, that they're not working hard enough. I think that those are the people in our economy that are working the hardest. Often these people have 3 jobs that they're juggling, right? And their spouse might also be working 2 jobs, and they're working the hardest jobs. The idea that those people aren't working hard enough, and if they only put in a little bit more effort, they could bring themselves above the poverty line. I think it's it's actually just almost offensive to those people to keep perpetuating this notion. But moving on to this second idea then, right? And even just the notion and construction of the American dream. Because the idea that people are responsible for their own happiness and that if they work hard that they can make it, that very rhetoric is actually used to justify cutting access to programs that deal with structural inequality, right? So this is the idea that certain political groups use in the United States. They say, well, why should we pay more for welfare if people choose to be poor? If they just can't get off their asses and get a good job, why should we subsidise them? Why should we subsidise access to healthcare? If they just got a good job, they could get an employer who would pay for their healthcare for them, right? So this glorification of individualism means that there's a constant undercutting of programs, which means that when Americans do get sick, or when Americans aren't accessing education, or they are unable to afford rent, right, they are blamed for that system, right? And there isn't a movement to change the very virtue of that system. I was going to take 2 questions if the other speaker had one.
Yes. So, where do we draw the line between ideals and pragmatics in this debate?
Okay, thank you. I don't need that. Right. Okay. So, I mean, the construction of the American dream is an ideal, right? And it's an ideal that all Americans believe in or want to believe in, right? And that's the thing I'm going on to in my last point, right? But I think that we can prove that that ideal isn't true or isn't true for most people if we pragmatically prove that it isn't true for most people, right? That if you work hard, that you are unlikely to break out of that system, right? So I think that that's what you're getting at with that question, right? But look, we actually do concede that some people will make it against the odds. So there will be an Obama and there will be an Oprah, and there are some people, very rarely, whose talents are so powerful that they overcome systemic barriers, right? But I actually think that's the worst possible thing that could happen, right? And that it doesn't justify their case, right? Because when you have one person who is so extraordinary that they rise out of the system, right, then every other person who comes from their group is told, well, if Obama made it, why couldn't you? If we had a black president, how can you be still blaming systemic racism for your inability to get a job, for your inability to make it off food stamps or whatever it is, right? But even moving beyond specific minority groups, right? The fact, more broadly, the fact that 1 in a million does make it is dangerous because we all look at that person and we say, well, I could be them, right? We delude ourselves into thinking that we are as capable as Bill Gates, that we are going to be the next Mark Zuckerberg, that if we drop out of college, it's okay because one day we could be a millionaire, right? So, because we want that cold comfort, or the warm comfort, rather, of believing that it could be us, right? And because all of us individually, in our own heads, think that we work hard, right? So we know that we have the ambition to succeed, right? So what this does, and what the perpetuation of the American dream does, is it deludes us into thinking that our current circumstances are temporary, right? So that if we're just above the poverty line, or if we're on food stamps, or whatever it is, that's not going to be how it is for the rest of our lives, because we will make it if we continue to work hard. But that's, for most of us, for millions of us, that is not true. Your circumstances are not temporary. You will never become a millionaire. It is unlikely that you will ever own property in this current financial situation that we're in, and it is unlikely that you will ever actually pay off your student debt. But the fact that you believe that it is temporary means that you don't actually work to change structures that oppress you, or to change structures that keep most of the people down, right? Because you believe that you are better than everyone in your group. You believe that your circumstances or the inequality that you face is only short term, and you believe in the American dream and you think that you're going to make it. Look, for most of us, for millions of us, we're not going to make it, and that alone shows that the American dream is dead. We're proud to propose. Thank you.
We on the side of the opposition believe in the American dream, not because it is achievable or has ever been attained, but because it is fundamentally a process. We think on the side of the government, they have misinterpreted what the American dream stands for and fundamentally made the debate about facts, when really what the American dream is about aspirations and principles. We think that fundamentally the American dream is an ideal that we strive to achieve. Yes, America may not be perfect. Yes, America may fall short. And yes, America probably has not lived up to this ideal at any point in its history. But it has tried. It is for this reason that we are proud to oppose today's motion. I'll be bringing you 2 points of positive matter. First, the American dream is an aspirational concept. And second, the American dream is necessary to fight political pessimism. But before that, I'd like to do some extraneous rebuttal. So, Maeve stands up here and tells you that the system is fundamentally broken, but they come from the UK, and in the UK, two different parts of their country, Ireland and Scotland, both want to leave. And it is that sort of division that demonstrates a broken system. Also, if we wanted to stand up here and list examples, we could list the example of Theresa May, or UKIP, or Nigel Farage. All of these are indications that their society has problems, but not that it's fundamentally broken. And we think that we can point all day long at these, but that's not sufficient to prove their case. They also talk a lot about barriers, but we think that their side of the house has problems but no solutions. We think that only our side of the house has solutions to these issues. Next, they talk a lot about this co-optation argument, how the American dream gets used for nefarious political purposes. But we would argue that that's actually what happens when people lose faith in the American dream. Finally, they make this argument about how when we think that it could be us, we could be the next Bill Gates, we think that that's actually not what the American dream is. We think that the American dream is people standing up and demanding change and greater equality. But on to my first point. The American dream is an aspirational concept. We think that this is true for two reasons. First, America is a country founded upon ideals. We can see this when we look at the constitutions that says, we the people in order to form a more perfect union. And we think that this idea of forming a more perfect union is fundamentally what America is all about. It's not that the union would be perfect at the outset, but that perfection and movement towards it is a process and a laudable goal. Second, when we look at the base of the Statue of Liberty, it tells us, give us your poor, your tired, your huddled masses. And we think that this sort of concept is an aspiration for America. It's not saying that it fundamentally does this all the time. It's not saying that this is even entirely achievable. But it is saying that liberty is an ideal and that welcoming people in is something good. And so we can see that America is fundamentally a country of ideals. We think that this matters for two reasons. First, we think that on their side of the house, they want to declare aspiration dead.
Question.
Yes.
Okay. If it is true that having the American dream as an aspirational idea is one that is succeeding in making America better in the future, how do you account for the fact that things like hostility to immigration is at an all-time high, whereas presumably if that argument were true, we'd have expected it to decrease over the years?
Absolutely. You know, the government raises a very valid point there, that right now America is having a very difficult time, that hostility towards immigrants is at an all-time high, but the reason for that hostility is because of the welcoming. The reason for the hostility is because America has a long history of bringing in immigrants and bringing in refugees, and that has led to a backlash. And while we disagree with that backlash and think that that backlash is a bad thing, we don't think that that is fundamentally proof that the American dream is dead, but rather that there are forces in America that want to fight against it and that have fundamentally lost faith in it, that we think you get on your side of the house that we don't get on ours. And so, really, this proves that it's an aspirational concept because on their side of the house, they don't have a value system to orient themselves towards. Secondly, we think that idealism is fundamentally good because having an ideal allows a country to strive for something rather than mere pragmatism. It doesn't accept what is, but rather has something that it thinks ought to be. I'll get to you at the bottom of this point. And because it has something that it thinks ought to be, it can improve itself, it can move forward, and it can progress. Yes?
Yeah, so you assume that we don't have ideals, but coming from the context, as we said, of having socialised healthcare, we might have ideals like everyone has a right to be treated with respect and dignity, and it's not their individual responsibility to have that kind of system.
Yes, and we think on the side of the opposition that people should be able to get universal health care, but to say that that's not an ideal in America is to ignore the millions of Americans who fight for universal health care, who stand up for universal health care, and who demand that from the government, and we think that the American dream animates that movement, which brings me to my second point. The American dream is necessary to fight against political pessimism. We think that political pessimism is bad for two reasons. First, political pessimism leads to inaction. When people are pessimistic and believe that circumstances can't change, when they think that what is all that ever will be, there's no point in voting. There's no point in getting involved, and there's no point in getting active. And we think that this just leads to the reification of bad situations and terrible policies. Second, we think that when people are politically pessimistic, they accept the world as it is rather than what it owes them and what it ought to be. And we think that the American dream fundamentally fights against this. We think that the American dream fixes this problem in three ways, because at the end of the day, the American dream is necessary to inspire people to make change. We think we can see this in the fact that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez won an election on a platform pushing for greater change. We think that we can see this in the fact that there are millions of Americans who supported Bernie Sanders. We think that we can see this in the fact that right now steelworkers are getting ready to strike because they feel like they deserve more pay. We think that this even goes back historically to people like Alice Paul and Martin Luther King, who demand greater rights for groups that didn't have them. We think that at the end of the day, this is what the American dream is about fundamentally. Inspiring people to take up not the world as it is, but to demand that it be better, to take a stand for something, to fight for those changes, and to believe that America can be better. We are not arguing that America doesn't have problems, but we think that all the barriers that Mabe talks about, and we think that all of the issues of inequality that they talk about can only be fixed on our side of the house, where we aspire to create a more perfect union, where we believe in the American dream, where we fight for the ideals of greater equality of opportunity, where we stand up for an ideal and use it to fight against political pessimism, to be involved, to be activists, to demand that America be better because we know it can be. And we think that that is what the American dream is on our side of the house, which is why we are proud to oppose and believe the American dream is not dead.
Our contention is that the American dream is dead as a result of its own contradictions. That is this type of society you create when you value individuals being able to keep their own gains, rewarding one of hard work, and everyone being able to succeed individually in a pursuit of happiness, is one that conspires to undermine those values over time. It's not true that the American dream is aspirational and we get closer to this perfect state. It's that we get further away. The current backlash isn't temporary, but it's one that is growing stronger over time and is an inevitable result of a number of contradictions that exist within the system. That's what I'm going to talk about in this speech today. First of all, a few miscellaneous pieces of rebuttal to the case that we've just heard. Number one, he says that the UK is bad as well because Ireland and Scotland want to leave. I mean, probably our education system is at least a little bit better, given presumably most people in the UK might know that Ireland is not part of the UK and hasn't been for almost a century. But I mean, sure, fine. We concede. The UK is the worst country in the world. Our contention then is just that our contention is just that the US dream has failed, not necessarily even that America is a particularly bad place to live. Secondly, we're told confusingly that the American dream is one of demanding equality. I mean, I'm pretty sure your average American would be surprised to find out that the country that got closest to fulfilling the American dream was communist Russia, and in fact North Korea today is doing a better job than any American politician. I think this is probably not a reasonable interpretation of what is meant by the American dream. Thirdly, we're told that, well, our other ideas might not be as good. Like what else have you have? At least it's better than nothing. Right? That might be true. There definitely are worse ideals in the American dream out there. Like, we're not saying it's the worst thing of all time. But again, that doesn't mean that it hasn't failed. If your car has crashed, its wheels have fallen off, and you've gone through the front windscreen, you wouldn't stand there and say, well, it was a successful journey because at least the car didn't also catch fire at the end of it. Finally, we get the claim that it is necessary to believe in the American dream in order to avoid political pessimism. But I would point out that most of the solutions that they give, things like voting, things like taking up activism, things like getting involved in your wider community, are collective ones. And these are ones that are undermined by a dream which places the emphasis upon individual success and you succeeding individually within it. Like, we do concede maybe that this could be sometimes a useful motivation to struggle or to fight harder to change it. But the problem is, even with the people he talks about, even if he points to Sanders or Martin Luther King, the reforms at all the point couldn't fight against the American dream, because to do so is seen as un-American. So they were unable to make the necessary criticisms and tackle the real problems at the heart of US society, because to do so would have lost them credibility, would have made them seen as disloyal, would have made them be seen as un-American. We think this is a bigger barrier than the potential risk of pessimism, which we concede could sometimes be a problem on our side of the house. Okay, what are the contradictions which have caused the American dream to collapse and mean that it will keep on collapsing as we move forward through time? There's 5 of these. I'm going to go through each of them in order. Number one, an environment of competition, and specifically capitalist competition, is one that precludes the possibility for all individuals to succeed. Why? Because some people must necessarily always fail. Necessarily, if I have a job or get a promotion, Maeve can't get the same job or also have that promotion. If my business selling cars that's wheels fall off and catch on fire is successful, then presumably their business that does the same thing will become bankrupt as a result, and they would have to fail. Even in our education system, it's very often a competitive one, where there are limited places at colleges. You have to pay a large amount of money to attend. This necessarily means that if you have that spot, other people can't. So what this means is that necessarily some people were always going to fail from the beginning. It is not possible for every individual to succeed. Some of them would have to fail. The second reason is that the types of inequality that the system creates are ones that compound over time. So what I mean by this is fairly straightforward. Like, if we accept as part of the American dream that individuals should be able to keep the money they make and enjoy it as they will, we have to accept the fact that they're able to leave that money to their children. But this is a problem, because if you inherit some wealth, if you inherit a small loan of $1 million from your father, this means your businesses are more likely to succeed than those of other people who didn't inherit the same million. And this compounds over time. So your children are going to be even more successful than their children. But conversely, if due to the fact that your parents were unemployed, or they were in jail because they had a run of bad luck, or they had to steal bread in order to survive, this means it more likely that you're likely to fail in education, you'll skip school, you don't have parents there as good role models to guide you. So it's more likely you will also go to jail in the future, or you will have a worse life. And crucially, this inequality brings things like economic power. It brings political power along with it, where it's harder and harder for the non-rich to challenge the system, where when you need to individually fund your campaigns in order to even get selected in primaries, it just is the case that if your name is Clinton or Bush, or if you have millions of dollars to your name, you are more likely to succeed than others. Yes.
How do you motivate political action on your side of the House?
I mean, there's millions of things we could think of. Like pessimism even probably is a very good motivation. If we instead adopted an ideology that everything in the country was terrible and we had to fix it all, that would probably be a very good motivator for lots of people to do it. But and also, even if there weren't any others, that doesn't mean that the system itself hasn't failed. The third reason is to say that the ideology of the dream itself blocks efforts at change. So specifically, for example, we might need to have very high levels of taxes in order to redistribute money to poorer people, or in order to pay for good public services. This conflicts with the ideology that you should be able to enjoy the rewards of your own hard work. Similarly, things like hostility to collective action, or even a belief that the dream itself has always existed and is justified. This blocks things like reparations for the millions of Americans who were brought here as slaves and never had an equal starting point. When some people, literally from the beginning of the creation of the US state, were in a worse off position than others, then they were never going to be able to succeed in a field of equal competition against those who are more privileged. Fourthly, the need to justify the failures of some groups further undermines efforts at change. So what I mean by this is this: look, it is obvious to anyone that some states are poorer than others. That if you come, that some states in the Deep South or whatever are poorer than East Coast elites. Now, we can recognise that and say, look, this is due to structural factors, problems of long-term poverty, all the problems we've talked about. But if you don't believe this, if you do believe that everyone who works hard succeeds, then conversely, the people who fail must fail because they've not been working hard enough. This is where you get extremely harmful stereotypes like the redneck stereotype, or liberals looking down at people in middle America as being too poor and stupid and worse than them. You have similar problems with race, where the American dream helps to spread the ideology that black people are, due to some sort of cultural or racial factors, are responsible for their own relative poverty or their own relative mistreatment by wider American society. And the problems with this is that the losers in this system either give up or they get mad. Like if you know that you're not a failure and you're not a layabout, but still you've lost your job or still your business has failed, then you must have been cheated in some way. So you blame other people. You blame the immigrants for taking your jobs. You blame the East Coast liberals for taxes being too high. Whereas when the problem was that the system was stacked against you from the beginning. Look, it is not just that the American dream is dead. It's because of these reasons it was always going to fail. The ideology collapsed under its own contradictions. These problems were seeds in the revolution, were strengthened after the Civil War, and meet their logical conclusion in the current climate of partisanship and of entrenched partisanship and polarization, where political solutions to problems have moved further away and the fabric of US society is threatened. The American dream has been dead for a long time. Its corpse is getting in the way. It is time to get rid of it.
All right. So the government today has brought you an interesting case. What we see today is that they reject the fundamental notion that we have made progress in today's society. And what we see is that we fundamentally have. And for example, they talk about how the American dream is a contradiction in itself. And as my partner Matt talked about, that there can't be a contradiction in the statement necessarily because it is an ought statement. It is a value statement, not a statement of being. And what we see is we are continuing to work towards this goal of realizing where every single American has the opportunity that they deserve. And we see it's a continuing process by which we are getting better at. And furthermore, they bring up that North Korea and the USSR is better at the dream than America is. But we see that's fundamentally a straw man of what the American dream is about. What we see is that North Korea and the USSR are based upon societies that are inherently stratified based on simply just everyone's equal, and that is a straw man of the American dream because that the whole predication of the American dream is that people work hard. People get what they work for, and that is the key of what we're talking about today. And furthermore, they talk about how the environment of capitalism precludes the dream of precludes the American dream. And we see that this is not, it's missing the point, so to speak. We see that every nation, as I was talking about my first point of positive matter, that every nation is built upon this notion that people should work hard and get ahead in life. And we see that they would talk about how reparations for slavery and things like that. But we see that we have been making progress since our foundation. We've given the women to right to vote. We've given the minorities the right to vote. We've instituted programs that have made our society better off. And what we see is that they talk about how the reactionary policies and attitudes that are coming out of America right now is not a product of the American dream. We see that the American dream is not isolated in this. We see that this is happening across the world, and we argue that is the fundamental process of modernity, of modernizing a society, that people will inevitably reject this progress and what that brings. So this brings me to my first point of positive matter. What we see is that I'll take this as a lens of bringing it outside of America. We talk a lot about the internal problems with America. We see that America has instituted the American dream across the world. So first, we embrace the ideal not just domestically as we've been talking about, but this declaration of he who works the hardest gets ahead has reverberated throughout the world. First, a historical example. After World War II, we saw those things such as the Marshall Plan that restructured post-World War II Europe and transformed static and stratified societies of Europe into societies of progress, societies of development, and societies of mobility. And we see that economic growth has boomed, and so has democracy in Europe. And yeah, go ahead.
Okay, you first tell us that the sort of current political backlash is in fact a general problem of modernity.
Yeah.
And then secondly, that the US has been successful in exporting the US dream to other countries.
Yeah.
So isn't the fact that these other countries are also suffering the problems of the current political backlash evidence that the US dream is then failing across the world?
Well, what we see is countries that haven't embraced the dream, like North Korea, like the USSR, and other reactionary nations, are also seeing this backlash as they modernize their economies, their industries, and their societies. Places such as the Middle East are experiencing extreme strife because of the simple modernity that is being experienced in that area. And then that brings me into my second example, that the U.S. is looked as a role model onto the rest of the world. What we see is that the United States has proposed a model by which democracy and prosperity are the keys to everything. We see that this model has been embraced by developing nations, and we see that this is not just a place for our huddled masses, but it is also a place that serves as a model for economic opportunity which binds us together. We are the bastions of economic prosperity and the arguments of free, unfettered capitalism. What we see is that that has spread to other nations and things such as examples such as the EU and other free trade agreements. And then a third example, Hollywood. We need to go no further than Hollywood than the concept of the American dreams. Films such as An American Tail or the classic Rocky movies have become wildly popular throughout the world, and we see that this is an exportation of the American dream. And what this is important because this people want this dream. It's worth sharing. It's worth becoming popular. And it's worth analyzing the fact that the nations want this dream. And that is important because this brings me to my fourth and final example, the Occupy Wall Street movement as well as the Arab Spring. And we see that these are tied. And that the Arab Spring is took a page right out of the Occupy Wall Street movement. We see that fundamentally, during the protests, the sense of injustice and solidarity are key instances in which people have worked together, and that is reverberated throughout those protests. And we see that uniquely, this supports the notion of democracy. And this is true because the American dream is tied to democracy, to freedom, as my partner Matt talked about, the huddled masses and the more perfect union. And we see that we hold the creation, promotion, and maintaining of democracy is the key point of what we're discussing in today's round. Matt talked about political pessimism, and that is a key to preventing political pessimism is the key to which we preserve, create, and build democracy. And since the days of the French Revolution, nations have turned to America for inspiration on how to implement this model. And the American dream, in the end, is simply a chance and a hope, and you should oppose the motion for several reasons. But first, I'll answer your question.
So, do you think that Trump's America should be a role model?
What we see is that every nation has had its issues, and every nation has strife. What we see is that America has not given in to one bad actor, one bad president, one bad group, one bad legislature, and we see that we continue our forward march on into the modern society and promotion of liberal Western economic values. And what we see is that what we are talking about here is that democratic Western ideology is tied up in the American dream. It's the same thing in our minds. And what we see and what we proved today with all the plethora of examples I've provided, that the American dream is necessary to preserve these values and avoid the impacts that Matt talks about with political pessimism, and how this ought statement, not an is statement, an ought statement is used to better people in society. And so we see that on the government side of the House, that they ignore the fact that the American dream is a conceptual analysis, not a physical statement. And what we see is that even if inequality exists, we hold that the American dream has reduced inequality overall, that we have made progress as a society, and we can evidence by the fact that we have a more perfect union, as my partner talked about. And secondly, we have shown the American dream that abandoning it fixes nothing. And that lastly, the American dream is alive and well, not only in the United States, but throughout the world. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to do two things in this response speech. Three things, actually. First of all, I'm going to talk a bit of rebuttal about the extension that we just heard from that speaker. Then I'm going to clash the idea whether the American dream has failed, which I think they basically conceded in the last speech. And then finally I'm going to talk about, even if it has failed, whether the ideal helps people or hurts people more. Okay, on rebuttal then. The last speaker says, well, there has been some progress in America. I mean, we would say in our team that there has been some progress in spite of the American dream rather than because of the American dream. And I'm going to elaborate on that a little bit more. But we also got this kind of the shifting of the debate in the last speech, right? Whereby the American dream has now just become everything that like anyone does in the West, right? Or is synonymous with like values of democracy, right? I think that shift rhetorically means that they've at least conceded the stuff that we're talking about, which was the promotion of individualism or the promotion of hard work above all else, right? That they're conceding that those values at least aren't working or aren't emulated across the modern world or in the Western world at least, right? And it's just the democratic stuff that we're talking about. But I would also point out as well that like the EU and other states aren't America, because we actually have done things like socialise our healthcare, something that we've tried to be pretty adamant about as we think that is a good idea. We aren't as individualistic as Americans are because of their American dream. Although like some aspects of American society, I mean, like I don't know how, like yes, we watch Hollywood movies, right? But it doesn't mean that that necessarily means that the American dream hasn't failed, or that it is something that's worth emulating. Maybe we just think American actors are really good looking, right? It doesn't mean that the premise and the system and like the promise of the American system is worth emulating. That's what I asked about Trump, right? Because to get around the Trump issue, the opposition team keeps saying things like basically that he's an aberration, basically that we've overcome hard times before, right? I'm going to be dealing with this when I talk about like the ideal of the American dream. But basically, I don't think that Trump is an aberration. Owen tells you that it's the contradictions that are making the system fall apart now, and I think that Trump is probably the embodiment of those contradictions. But I'd also say their conceptualization that progress is inevitable means means that we become complacent towards people like Trump and think that it's an aberration, and we don't think that's good enough on government. Okay, so is the American dream a failure? Look, we told you several things on this, none of which we're really engaged with. We told you that some people have to fail because wealth is relative and success is zero sum. We told you that structural inequality means that opportunity is unequally distributed between people. So just because you have a Statue of Liberty doesn't mean that all people have the same access to liberty or access to the pursuit of happiness, right? So, I mean, their engagement on this point, and probably the most important clash in this debate, whether the American dream has failed, on the debate whether the American dream has failed. Their engagement with this is just to say that, look, it's just an ideal. So it doesn't matter whether it's actually true or not. It doesn't matter whether it's failing for millions of Americans across America, because it's just the ideal that matters. But look, we say that it does matter because we laid out consequences of the American dream failing, right? It matters for the people who are blamed for their own poverty because we believe in this ideal. It matters for the people who work 3 jobs but are still called lazy because they weren't able to pull themselves up by their bootstraps. They weren't able to be the Bill Gates. They weren't able to be the Mark Zuckerberg, right? So conceding that it hasn't worked but it's just an ideal is incredibly damaging to their case, and it's incredibly insulting for those people who have to face with the consequences of the dream failing, right? But then, just lastly, on this idea of it being an ideal, look, they tried to say that the American dream makes us fight for equality, right? So first of all, the first response we have to this is, Owen said, that voting and collective action is obviously distinct from this idea of individual responsibility and this idea that you individually can rise up against your circumstances. Actually, the whole point of the Statue of Liberty is that we'll take in all of these people, but no matter who you are, no matter what your creed is, no matter where you come from, you can be successful, right? And that is very different than saying that you as a minority group should agitate and work together to change that structure. I'd almost say those things are antithetical, right? But also what I said in my speech was this idea that minorities believe that they're, a lot of them anyway, people coming from these groups think that their circumstances are short term because of the American dream, right? They think that because they work hard, even if they are facing oppression right now, that things will change for them, so that they don't agitate as a group because they think individually they may make it out of the system, right? But I'd also add on this idea that the American dream is an ideal, right? That it glorifies the idea that progress is inevitable, right? Which breeds complacency. So they tell us that we're being pessimistic, right? But I think optimism is incredibly dangerous, right? Because it means you don't fight for the rights that make sure that Roe v. Wade isn't repealed. The last speaker got up here and said, well, we gave women the right to vote. Thank you, congratulations, right? But the thing is that if we are continually optimistic and continually believe that America will always progress, we don't continue to fight for these ideals because we take them for granted, because we think that America is good, right? And that it is worth emulating and that it can never do any wrong, right? But even Owen told you on this, even if politicians do advocate for change, right? Even admitting that America has problems is seen as unpatriotic at times, right? Because you are the land of opportunity, so it's very difficult to say that some people can't access that, right? But even if they do enact reforms, they can only be shallow, right? Because the American dream, precludes them from going any further along that line, right? So, look, basically, they concede that this is failing for most people, and we say that because it fails for most people, because it's an ideal that doesn't work in practice, the glorification of that ideal alone hurts more people than it helps. And for those reasons, you should support government.
We on the side opposition believe that America is a flawed country that has ideals that it strives for, and that the process of striving is of the utmost importance. It is for this reason that we are proud to oppose today's motion. We will be asking 2 crystallizing questions to clarify this debate. First, whether the American dream has failed, and second, which team leads to a better America. But first, a little bit of extraneous rebuttal. Now, the side government wants you to believe that we've conceded that the American dream doesn't work for most Americans. But we think that they've created a very skewed view of America. And this is embodied by the last speaker's statement that we don't want to let Trump be emblematic of America on our side, that we don't want to focus on Trump on our side. And we think that that's the problem with their side, is that their side is focused on the few people, the Bill Gates, the Trumps, the few rather than the many. But our side, we give you compelling examples for why, for most Americans, the American dream is still relevant, it's still important, it's still a concept that they use. And with that, I would like to turn to my first crystallizing question, whether the American dream has failed. They say on their side that the American dream fails because of its contradictions. However, on our side of the House, we make it abundantly clear that it's an ought statement. It's an ideal. It's something that we strive to. And we give you two examples of what this ought statement is. First, that America says that it wanted to create a more perfect union. And second, that America believed in letting in everyone into the country and letting in your tired, your huddled masses. And we think that on their side of the House, they talk a lot about how people believe that when you work hard, you should be able to accomplish things. And we think that that's not in and of itself a bad principle. We think that the idea that people should be able to prosper if they work hard is a good idea. And we think that the idea that people should have equality of opportunity is a good idea on our side of the House. And while we're saying on our side of the House that yes, sometimes this gets misused, this gets misappropriated, sometimes people use this for bad purposes, this doesn't make the ideal bad, but rather demonstrates why we need the ideal to hold these politicians accountable in the first place. It's telling that on their side of the House, in the last speech of this debate, they don't tell you how they fix the problems. They don't tell you what the alternative to the American dream is. They don't say what the option is other than pessimism. But we think that this is the problem with that side of the House, that if you declare the American dream dead and you declare it a failure, then you discount all the efforts that people in this country have made to fight for the ideal. They want to talk about Trump, but they don't want to talk about people who have protested against Trump. They want to talk about how we don't have universal health care, but they don't want to talk about the people who fought for universal health care in this country. They want to let the few people who have denied what the American dream is to the American people to characterize the American dream for America. And we think it is that characterization that fundamentally misses the point of the American dream, but also demonstrates why the American dream is so necessary, why we need something to believe in, and why America needs something to fight for and something to strive for. And we think that this idea that having something to strive for is good has fundamentally gone unrefuted on their side of the House. They tell you that optimism is bad, but realistically, optimism can be good because optimism is the belief that you can change things. On their side of the House, they frame optimism as complacency, but we frame pessimism as complacency because when you are pessimistic and think that nothing can change, then why would you go out there and vote? Why would you go out there and fight? Why would you go out there and protest? The answer is you wouldn't. You have to have hope in the future in order to be engaged in politics. And that is why we don't think that the American dream has failed on our side of the House. Second, who leads to the best America? Their side of the House or our side of the House? We think that our side of the House fundamentally leads to a better side of a better America. We give you the examples of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who won an election on the back of an optimistic message. We give you the example of Bernie Sanders and the people who supported him, and we think that both of these demonstrate the ways in which optimism and political engagement go hand in hand. How when people believe that America deserves them more, they are more willing to stand up for themselves. We think that when steel workers are preparing to protest against steel companies for better wages, we think that that demonstrates that they believe that they are owed more, and that feeling like you are owed more by this country and by businesses is a good thing because fundamentally you're more likely to go out there and fight. You're more likely to stand up for your rights, and you're more likely to advocate for equality. And we think that their side of the House doesn't give you anything like that. They tell you that optimism can be bad because then you become complacent. But all of our examples on our side of the House demonstrate that optimism is in fact the bomb against complacency, that only with optimism can you avoid simply accepting bad situations. We think the fact that many Americans are apathetic and don't vote is evidence that political nihilism and political pessimism are bad things. Only when people are inspired, only when they feel optimistic, only when they feel like things can change, does it feel like voting matters? Does it feel like being an activist matters? And we think that on our side of the House, we fundamentally lead to a better America because people are going to be more politically engaged. They're going to be more active. They're going to continue fighting for universal health care. On their side of the House, what do? We don't have universal health care. I guess we give up now. On their side of the House, Trump won the election. I guess we give up now. On their side of the House, I think that America is unequal. I guess we give up now. That is all that they give you on their side of the House. On our side of the House, by fighting for the American dream, we are fighting for the belief that America can get better. That when this nation said it was trying to create a more perfect union, it meant it. And that the voices of Americans standing up and fighting for a better country, a better tomorrow, and a better America prove that the American dream is alive and well in the citizens standing up for democracy today.
I'd like to thank our competitors and thank you for tuning in and invite you to join Loyola at any of its many events. Turn to the School of Communication page to find more about the debate team and our upcoming events. Thank you.